The United Nations and the Emerging New World Order. That was the topic at a news conference held today by the John Birch Society. The event featured William Jasper, senior editor of the New American magazine and author of a book called Global Tyranny, Step by Step. Mr. Jasper explains his view of how the planned New World Order might affect rights guaranteed under the Constitution. Here now is today's news conference.
My name is Charles Wassam. I'm a physician in Northern Virginia and Washington, D.C. And I'd like to thank those of the media that are here. I'm here to introduce Mr. William Jasper. He is in Washington to promote his new book, Global Tyranny, Step by Step, the United Nations and the Emerging New World Order. Mr. Jasper's carefully documented book demolishes the illusion that the world is safer following the apparent demise of communism. The New World Order under the United Nations would mean, among other things, an end to our God-given rights given us and secured by the Constitution. Mr. Jasper is the senior editor of the bi-weekly The New American news magazine. He'll be speaking this evening at Capitol Baptist Church, 3435 Aston Street in Annandale, Virginia, at 8 o'clock. For further information about the speech, you may call at 703-644-9712. Now I'd like to present Mr. William Jasper.
Thank you. It has been nearly 50 years since the end of World War II, when a war-weary world embraced a dangerous idea and a dangerous organization. Not since World War II, not since that time nearly 50 years ago, has the United Nations enjoyed such an apparent popularity and resurgence of support in this country. I find that alarming. Not too many years ago, like many Americans, I was an avid supporter of the United Nations. Like many, I viewed it as it had been presented to me in the standard textbook presentation as a noble aspiration of mankind for peace, brotherhood, goodwill, and harmony, and mankind's last best hope for peace, for an end to war. However, the intervening years, the last couple of decades, and a great deal of research and reporting on the United Nations have changed my idea of it considerably. I contend, and the subject of my book is that the United Nations, from all the recorded history that we have of it, from its founding, from its founders, those who designed it, the UN Charter, those who organized the support for it in this country, from all that we know of it, the United Nations indeed is not, has not been an organization designed to bring about world peace. It is an organization that has been designed and promoted and continuously projected by those who have been in the forefront of its support to become a world government. One of the most important journals in the world today, Time calls the most influential journal in print, is Foreign Affairs, published by the Council on Foreign Relations. This particular issue is the winter 92-93 issue, the current issue of Foreign Affairs. Very important because there is an article in here by Boutros Boutros-Ghali, Secretary General of the United Nations, in this special issue, which is titled Advice for Mr. Clinton. Advice for President Clinton. I'd like to just open by reading for the first couple of sentences from Boutros-Ghali's article entitled Empowering the United Nations. We hear a lot of this today. I'll cover a few more examples of this. Over and over again, we hear of the need to empower the United Nations. And here's how he begins. A new chapter in the history of the United Nations has begun. With newfound appeal, the World Organization is being utilized with greater frequency and growing urgency. The new era has brought new credibility to the United Nations. Together, the international community and the UN Secretariat need to seize this extraordinary opportunity to expand, adapt, and reinvigorate the work of the United Nations so that the lofty goals as originally envisioned by the Charter can begin to be realized. Unfortunately, far too many Americans are at present going along with that view that the United Nations needs to be energized, that it needs to be reinvigorated, and it's evident everywhere we look in the press today, in the media. Associated Press article here, time for the UN to wage war to win peace. The end of the Cold War may spur stronger world government. Mr. Strobe Talbot, editor-at-large of Time magazine, tells us here in his major article here, The Birth of the Global Nation. Of course, Mr. Talbot has now been appointed by the President to be his representative to the Soviet Union, or to Russia. Mr. Talbot tells us in this editorial of his, but it has taken the events of our wondrous and terrible century to clinch the case for world government. And he goes on to say, federalism has provided the most successful of all political experiments, and organizations like the World Federalist Association have for decades advocated it as the basis for global government. The World Federalist Organization, which he mentions, has again become very active and is taking out advertisements, for instance, like this one in the New York Times. John Anderson here pictured. John Anderson, 1980 presidential candidate, asks your support for a UN World Federation. World peace requires world laws. Global problems require global governance. Join John Anderson now in working to transform the United Nations into an empowered, democratic world federation with, goes on to list here, global legislative powers, enforcement powers, judicial powers. And in conjunction with that, World Federalist Association circulating a petition around the country, getting people across the country to sign a petition on strengthening the United Nations. Petition to members of Congress, to representatives, senators, to the President. And many other organizations seem to be resurrected now with the new popularity of the United Nations. The World Constitution and Parliament Association sending out an urgent invitation as organizing agent for provisional world parliament and global ratification. Dear citizens of the earth, calling on all citizens to contact their representatives, push for a strengthened United Nations to bring about a world government. Other organizations like World Citizen, published by the Association of World Citizens, very openly calling for, as Boutros-Ghali says, empowering the United Nations. As I've traveled across the country from the West Coast out here to the East Coast, in many different communities along the way, I see this movement taking shape in one community after another. This up in Middletown, Connecticut, the Middletown Press. Just as I was there a couple of days ago, on the front page, we see former Socialist Prime Minister of Jamaica, Michael Manley, calling for a new world order. Manley, new order brings hope, despair. And in here, Mr. Manley says that the United Nations must be given new powers over the world economy and over the world environment. The United Nations must become the global regulatory force. At the same time, in Hartford, Connecticut, the same day, we see several programs being promoted on the United Nations and the New World Order. Here's one called The Search for the New World Order by Ambassador Charles Hill at Hartford Seminary. Even in American Legion, we see. American Legion, which has usually been very strong on protecting American sovereignty and whatnot. In the current issue, March '93, we have an article, "A Better Way to Keep the Peace. Instead of relying on the U.S. military, the United Nations should form its own permanent standing force." One of the most blatant examples of this appeared 2 weeks ago on CNN, a program called Our Planetary Police, in which the United Nations was enthusiastically endorsed and urged to take on new responsibilities, not only in what is traditionally called UN peacekeeping, but in UN enforcement of global environmental edicts from the United Nations. In addition, many other things, but currently we see the United States Commission on Improving the Effectiveness of the United Nations holding hearings around the country. We say hearings. They have not truly been hearings. They have been very one-sided propaganda forums. The people who have been invited to speak and who have spoken at these hearings for this commission, which was established by an act of Congress, hearings that have been held in Los Angeles, San Francisco, Atlanta, and coming up on April 16th in Chicago, the people who have been featured have been representatives of the United World Federalists, United Nations Association, the Association of World Citizens, organizations which all advocate a strengthened, empowered United Nations and a diminished or abolished United States Constitution. Much of this new prestige and acceptance for the United Nations, of course, came about in the last couple of years, particularly with the Persian Gulf War for the New World Order under President George Bush. 30 years ago, the John Birch Society began a rather lonely campaign with the slogan, "Get us out of the United Nations and get the United Nations out of the United States." Back at that time, the United Nations enjoyed overwhelming popularity. At the end of the 1950s, the Gallup poll showed that about almost 9 out of 10 Americans had very high, positive, favorable attitudes toward the United Nations. For 30 years, we continued that message, bringing to the American people the facts about the United Nations, the history of the United Nations, that they were not getting through their standard textbook accounts or from the major media. During the 60s, 70s, and 80s, we saw, as recorded by the Gallup annual poll of American opinion on the United Nations, we saw a continual decline in American support from a high of 87% down to, towards the end of the 1980s, 1987, down to around 21%. That was the result of Americans coming to realize that the United Nations, far from being a forum for world brotherhood and peace, had indeed become and was continuously showing itself to be a propaganda forum for every communist, socialist, third world dictator to come here to the United States and from the rostrum of the UN to denounce, pillory, rebuke, and in otherwise insult not only the United States, but Western civilization, market economies, all of the Western free world. Not only that, but it became quite evident that the United Nations was also supporting terrorist organizations around the world, and that American citizens were paying for it. However, that decline in popularity has been at least temporarily reversed with the association of the United Nations with the patriotic fervor brought up behind the war to defeat Saddam Hussein. Although it was American military power, American military forces, American men and women in uniform, and largely American money that financed the operation, there was a fig leaf of international support, and the United Nations, according to the polls, was the main benefactor from the public relations. But that was George Bush. And now we have a new president, we are told, who he told us would bring change. How does that affect our situation in the New World Order and the United Nations? I contend that is extremely important because the United Nations, as Boutros-Ghali has proposed, is being empowered. It is being empowered in many ways that are affecting the United States and our citizens daily and will increasingly so in the coming weeks, months, and years. And unfortunately, it is being done with American citizens having very little to say about it, even being very little aware of it. We are right now in the middle of or closing in on tax day, when Americans are quite painfully aware of the heavy hand, the burden of government, of how the politicians here in Washington are spending their money and digging their hands deeper into the taxpayer's pocket. But very few taxpayers are aware that Boutros-Ghali, in his report last year, An Agenda for Peace, called for giving the United Nations taxing authority. And that on September 21st of last year, while speaking at the United Nations, President George Bush endorsed that report, heartily endorsed that report, and that we are seeing in the editorial policies of some of our major newspapers support for these policies, that the United Nations should be allowed to tax American citizens, indeed all citizens of the world, to tax our international travel, to tax our gasoline, to tax our cars. Proposals for a value-added tax, a global value-added tax. If you think that the politicians in Washington are out of touch with America and are in great need of a wake-up call, my friends, you have not seen anything to compare with the kind of lust for spending your hard-earned dollars that you will see if the United Nations gets a chance to tax you. We are seeing many other ways in which the United Nations is going to affect us very soon and very dearly. As the season heats up here, not because of global warming, but because of the natural phenomenon we call summer. It happens every year, and you go to turn on your air conditioner, you go to turn on your cooler, and you find that you have to have it reconditioned or have it repaired or have it tuned up. You're going to find that the prices for all those services have doubled, tripled, quadrupled, quintupled, or even more, thanks to the United Nations Montreal Convention on CFCs and ozone depletion. A completely false, scientifically disputed phenomena. The ozone depletion is not a crisis, does not demand global regulatory restrictions as we are now receiving under the United Nations protocol. However, various scientists and economists have figured that this may cost the world economy in the trillions of dollars, perhaps as many as $5 trillion to replace all of the equipment to meet all of the mandates under this international agreement, which was given to us under the auspices of the United Nations. More and more, we are seeing these mandates that are affecting our domestic lives being conducted, being forced upon us, not through anything through the traditional American legal system over which we have recourse, but through international agreement. This is very significant for our new administration because, as Foreign Affairs tells us in here, President Clinton, they're very encouraged because President Clinton is even more supportive of the United Nations than President George Bush. They said he would be more aggressive in supporting the UN in Yugoslavia. We shall see. Like his predecessor, George Bush, Bill Clinton is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, of the Trilateral Commission. Is that significant? I say, indeed it is. It is very significant. I spend a couple of chapters in the early part of my book going into the background, the history, going back to the foundation of those organizations, and showing that from the very beginning of the United Nations, preceding the United Nations, it has been the Council on Foreign Relations as a group and as individuals, members who have been not only the most prominent, but always in the forefront of promoting the idea of world government, promoting the United Nations as a nascent world government. And I contend it is impossible to understand the United Nations today, our growing involvement in it, and where it is headed without appreciating the fact that the United Nations was completely the creation of the Council on Foreign Relations, and that it is the Council on Foreign Relations, or CFR, that constitutes the driving force behind it today. And I would like to just, for instance, out of one of the many, many documents which I've gone to great lengths to present in the book Global Tyranny, this book, The United Nations Reborn, by Professor George Sherry, published by the Council on Foreign Relations, tells us this. After all, the UN Charter is the law of the land. After all, the UN Charter is the law of the land. Professor Sherry and the Council on Foreign Relations tell us that the UN Charter, not the U.S. Constitution, is the law of the land. I contend, and I think all Americans who at all treasure or value the legacy of freedom that we have here, all those officials who have taken an oath to uphold and defend the Constitution, know that the Constitution is the law of the land. However, for the last 45, almost 50 years, we have had a very insidious campaign incessantly going on through the law schools, through some of our major media, and through our major Council on Foreign Relations members in office who have been promulgating this erroneous and dangerous idea that the UN Constitution and treaties take precedence over the Constitution. And I have a chapter of my book, Chapter 6, Treaties and Treason, which goes into that in depth. One of the first major U.S. officials to promote this line was Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, one of the founding members of the Council on Foreign Relations, one of the founders of the United Nations. And he said this in a speech to the American Bar Association in April 1952. He said, following up with what Professor Sherry tells us here, Professor Sherry tells us the UN is the law of the land. That really had its genesis back here in April of '52, where John Foster Dulles says, treaties make international law, and also they make domestic law. Under our Constitution, treaties become the supreme law of the land. Treaty law can override the Constitution. Treaties, for example, can cut across the rights given the people by their constitutional Bill of Rights. What Secretary of State Dulles was saying, and what many of his followers and adherents have been saying and have put in the law books and have made precedents in the history books, convincing the, trying to convince the American people that treaty law, that a two-thirds vote of the Senate can wipe out your constitutional rights, can wipe out your Bill of Rights, is a dangerous, dangerous concept. And it is a subversive concept which will allow a simple majority, not even a two-thirds majority of the Senate. We've had some votes in the Senate where we have not had a, in fact, just recently, where a UN treaty was passed, and according to the congressional record and to the congressional sources, they did not give a roll call vote. There is no recorded vote on it. Last year, when the UN Covenant on Civil and Political Rights was passed, we can only document that 3 or 4 senators were present, and yet we're told that that treaty has passed, and now it can override the U.S. Constitution and the U.S. Bill of Rights. I've taken one chapter to go through the history of treaties and treaty law, citing the precedent going back from the Founding Fathers through the Federalist Papers on up through the Supreme Court decisions. It is very clear that a treaty which is in violation of the Constitution, which conflicts with the U.S. Constitution, is null and void. It does not override the Constitution, contrary to what Secretary of State John Foster Dulles says, contrary to what the Council on Foreign Relations says, contrary to what Professor Sherry says. The U.S. Constitution is still the law of the land. It overrides any treaties, regardless of what those with one world ideologies may say. This is important because, as Arthur Schlesinger Jr., himself a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, advisor to President Kennedy, Harvard professor, as he said, the Council on Foreign Relations is a front organization for the heart of the American establishment. They have been calling shots of American foreign policy for well over 50 years. The late Admiral Chester Ward, who was a member of the Council on Foreign Relations for nearly 2 decades, left the organization. He was Judge Advocate General of the United States Navy. He denounced it as a clique of one-world global government ideologists formed for the purpose of promoting disarmament and submergence of U.S. sovereignty and national independence into an all-powerful one-world government. It's a very serious charge from a man who was a member of the organization himself, had reached the highest levels of American military office. Many other prominent voices have warned us over the years, many others who have been in U.S. government positions in a position to know. But you have not heard about that. In a speech to the U.S. Senate on December 15, 1987, Senator Jesse Helms talked of this same influence that Chester Ward, Admiral Ward, had warned about. And again, this was a speech that should have received some attention, but the major establishment media completely censored it. Senator Helms said, "The influence of establishment insiders over our foreign policy has become a fact of life in our time. This pervasive influence runs contrary to the real long-term national security of our nation. It is an influence which, if unchecked, could ultimately subvert our constitutional order." He went on to say, "Private organizations like the Council on Foreign Relations, the Royal Institute of International Affairs, the Trilateral Commission, the Aspen Institute, etc., serve to disseminate and coordinate the plans for this so-called New World Order in powerful business, financial, academic, and official circles." We were told that with the new Clinton administration, we were going to get change. We were going to get a cabinet and administration that looks like America. In our special Clinton edition of the New American, we take a look at this new cabinet, at the new administration, and contrary to what we were told, the big untold story of 1992 and 1993, the big election story is not change, change, change. It's more of the same. Yes, we had a change from Republican to Democrat, but we see the same Council on Foreign Relations members in charge, the same under Mr. Clinton as under George Bush. We see as Secretary of State, Mr. Clinton's top transition team member, Warren Christopher, member of the Council on Foreign Relations and the Trilateral Commission. Les Aspin, Secretary of Defense, Council on Foreign Relations. Lloyd Bentsen, Secretary of Treasury, Council on Foreign Relations. Donna Shalala, Secretary of Health and Human Services, Council on Foreign Relations. Peter Tarnoff, Undersecretary for Political Affairs, President of the Council on Foreign Relations. Winston Lord, Assistant Secretary of State for Asian and Pacific Affairs, former President of the Council on Foreign Relations. And on it goes: Bruce Babbitt, Roger Altman, Alice Rivlin, Laura D'Angela Tyson, Anthony Lakes, Samuel Berger, Admiral Crowe, Clifton Wharton, on and on. Looks like from the way that we're going that we will see the same 300 to 400, 10 to 15% of the membership of the Council on Foreign Relations occupying the top echelons of the Clinton administration, same as we've seen last during the Bush administration, the Reagan administration. In 1979, during the Carter administration, Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater published a book with no apologies. And he said something about the Carter administration at that time that applies with equal force to, or more, to the current situation in the Clinton administration. Said Senator Goldwater, when we change presidents, it is understood to mean that the voters are ordering a change in national policy. Since 1945, 3 different Republicans have occupied the White House for 16 years, and 4 Democrats have held this most powerful post for 17 years. There has been great turnover in personnel, but no change in policy. Example, during the Nixon years, Henry Kissinger, a Council on Foreign Relations member and a Nelson Rockefeller protege, was in charge of foreign policy. When Jimmy Carter was elected, Kissinger was replaced by Zbigniew Brzezinski, a Council on Foreign Relations member and a David Rockefeller protege. As he went on to say, we have the change of administration, but we see that the influences of the same organizations remain. He said of the Trilateral Commission and the Council on Foreign Relations, in my view, the Trilateral Commission represents a skillful, coordinated effort to seize control and consolidate the 4 centers of power: political, monetary, intellectual, and ecclesiastical. Obviously, we see that again in the Clinton administration. Obviously, we see it in the Council on Foreign Relations advice to Mr. Clinton in this particular issue of the New American Magazine. We went through that issue of Foreign Affairs. As far as I know, the only publication in the United States that surveyed this, which has been repeatedly cited as the most influential journal in the country. Why is it that they are, what is it that they are advising Mr. Clinton, and has he indicated his willingness to implement that advice? Indeed, he has. In fact, as we point out here, he was already well into implementing that advice. And what does that portend for America? As Admiral Chester Ward, member of the Council on Foreign Relations, says, those who read foreign affairs know what American policy will be months or years in advance. And why is it that an organization like the Council on Foreign Relations, which has held a virtual monopoly on the presidency, on 16 secretaries of state, 15 secretaries of the Treasury, 15 secretaries of defense, all of the top cabinet positions, why is that when we have our confirmation hearings that it is all right to bring up that Ron Brown has connections with this law firm and this corporation, or to go into the backgrounds of all the nominees and see what their personal conflicts of interest may be because of their connections with this corporation or this organization. And yet it is never permissible, it's never brought up in these hearings that this organization with a definite agenda, with an agenda which I contend and which the evidence overwhelmingly shows is one inimical to the United States, one which, as Chester Ward, a member of the organization, said they lust to give up the United States sovereignty to a one-world government. Why is it that these associations are never brought out? This is going to be especially important in the coming months as America becomes more entangled and involved in so-called peacekeeping operations around the world. As I mentioned, Boutros Boutros-Ghali came out with a document which very few Americans have seen, even fewer have read, called An Agenda for Peace. This came out in June of 1992. In September, as I mentioned, President Bush endorsed this, heartily endorsed this, and at the United Nations, in his speech to the group, announced that he was going to order the Air Force, Army, Marines, and Navy to begin training United Nations troops for peacekeeping operations, and that American military installations would begin being used, and he mentioned specifically Fort Dix, would be used for United Nations training of troops. Now, why is it that America must build down, must cut down its military powers? We must reduce our military budget, reduce our military spending for fiscal reasons, and because these troops are no longer needed, and yet we are told we should transfer part of this military budget that we're supposed to be savings for us, transfer this to the United Nations and begin transferring troops to the United Nations. Indeed, we're told in the last week that 5,000 U.S. troops may be left behind in Somalia, not under the U.S. flag, but under the UN flag. 25,000 U.S. troops under NATO command, we're told, may be sent into Bosnia-Herzegovina, again under the UN flag, under UN command. If you are a United States member of the United States Armed Forces, if your son or daughter is, your father, your relatives, your friends, or if you may be in the future, it is in your interest to ask some very serious questions about our move toward further involvement in and transfer of military authority to the United Nations. You may find yourself under United Nations command. What kind of rights do you have? What kind of support do you have under the United Nations Charter? More seriously still is the resurrection of a document 30 years old, brought out in 1961. Again, very few Americans have seen or are familiar with, but it is official United States policy, launched under the Kennedy administration, September 1961, under the title Freedom from War, the United States Program for General and Complete Disarmament in a Peaceful World, State Department document 7277. This was put together for the Kennedy administration under Secretary of State Dean Rusk, member of the Council on Foreign Relations, Secretary of Defense Robert Strange McNamara, member of the Council on Foreign Relations. And we see now the New York Times, LA Times, Foreign Affairs magazine, other major Council on Foreign Relations media voices telling us that specifically this program must be resurrected. Why? This is a three-part, three-stage program which will affect all Americans profoundly. In the third stage, and I'm quoting from it, in stage 3, progressive controlled disarmament would proceed to a point where no state, meaning no nation, would have the military power to challenge the progressively strengthened UN peace force. Official U.S. government policy 30 years ago has been piecemeal, parts of it already enacted, and now we are seeing a call for completing this program. What does that mean? It is very plain. In very simple terms, I contend that those officials who participated in drafting, promoting, and promulgating this policy were guilty of treason. Not a charge to be made or taken lightly. But how can it be anything but? An American official, elected, appointed, takes an oath to uphold and defend the Constitution of the United States. And yet in this document, they are saying, as our policy, we will transfer to the United Nations all American military forces so that we will not, nor will any other nation, be able to oppose or challenge this United Nations force. It is as subversive of our constitutional system, of all of our checks and balances, of all of our basic fundamental principles, as it would be to transfer all of our military to the Soviet Union or to any other foreign power. The United Nations is indeed a foreign power, and our American officials who are promoting this still today are undermining, are threatening to turn over America to an all-powerful one world government under the United Nations. John Foster Dulles himself said in his book War or Peace, "I have never seen any proposal made for collective security with teeth in it, or for world government or for world federation, which could not be carried out either by the United Nations or under the United Nations Charter." In this article by Boutros-Ghali, we see him saying, under the headline, "Peacekeeping is a growth industry." It's good to know something's growing these days, not the economy or any other industry, but peacekeeping, he says, is a growth industry. Very importantly here, he says, "Peacekeeping is the most prominent UN activity. The blue helmets on the front lines of conflict on 4 continents are a symbol of the United Nations commitment to international peace and security." And he goes on to say, "Peacekeeping is a UN invention. It was not specifically defined in the Charter, but evolved." A very important point which demonstrates the difference between the United States Constitution and the United Nations Charter. The United Nations Constitution very strictly limits government, very strictly sets down the powers of government, very strictly separates those powers so that government cannot grow, or makes it very difficult for government to grow, to encroach, to usurp, to take over powers. The United Nations Charter, on the other hand, is built as an open-ended document encouraging, absolutely guaranteeing continual usurpation, encroachment, or as Boutros-Ghali says, inventing and evolving. Americans should know from our own experience how even with all the strictures we have, all the safeguards we have in the Constitution, how still our government has grown, evolved, encroached, and usurped upon our freedoms. It is the height of folly to think that the United Nations would not do it also, in fact, even on greater scale. As one final note, as peacekeeping, so-called, is the major function of the United Nations, as Mr. Boutros-Ghali has said, it would be in our interest to dispose of some myths about that. During the summer of 1945, Ambassador J. Reuben Clark, who is one of America's foremost scholars in the field of international law, prepared an analysis of the UN Charter. Ambassador Clark's examination led him to conclude that the Charter, far from being a peace document, was indeed a war document. Ambassador Clark said, the Charter is a war document, not a peace document. It is built to prepare for war, not to promote peace. The ambassador noted, there is no provision in the Charter itself that contemplates ending war. It is true that the Charter provides for force to bring peace, but such use of force is itself war. Moreover, said Ambassador Clark, not only does the Charter organization not prevent future wars, but it makes practically certain that we shall have future wars, and as to such wars, it takes from us the power to declare them, to choose the side on which we shall fight, to determine what forces and military equipment we shall use in the war, and to control and command our sons who do the fighting, end quote. And the ambassador's predictions were soon borne out, first in Korea and then in Vietnam. The first 2 wars America fought with UN involvement, and the only 2 wars which the U.S. has ever failed to win. We must face the possibility, the likelihood even, that if we are to turn over American military power to the United Nations, that power could, I contend, would be used against us. We have many, one need only look at proposals and speeches in the United Nations. From the 186 some countries who are members, still the vast majority of them are dictatorships of one type or another, communist, socialist, Marxist, fascist, one kind of dictatorship or another, unfriendly to the United States, unfriendly to the whole idea of limited government. But even some of our friends are hardly our friends. I was at the United Nations Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro this past summer. Just prior to the summit, you may recall that United Nations official Maurice Strong, who was head of the Earth Summit, declared that the United States is the greatest threat to the world's ecological health. Maurice Strong said, in effect, the United States is committing environmental aggression against the rest of the world. At the environmental level, the United States is clearly the greatest risk. You have it from a top UN official itself, the United States is the greatest risk. How does that affect us? A very important thing, another very important event which took place last year, which most Americans heard not one word about. The United Nations changed its definition of threat to peace. No longer is threat to peace defined as someone attacking its neighbor with military force. No, now the United Nations can justify sending in so-called peacekeeping troops to end a threat to peace, which is now defined as ecological, environmental, or social instability. So you see, Mr. Strong, who cites the United States as being the aggressor in the world against the environment and the world's greatest risk, and his colleagues in the United Nations could justify sending in the UN blue helmets or green helmets, as they're advocating for the UN environmental police, against the United States. And that's why we dedicated a special issue of the New American to the environment, our Resilient Earth issue, dealing with the Earth Summit and all of the ecological crises that are being used to justify world government and United Nations control. Many years ago, Senator Robert Taft said, "The UN has become a trap. Let's go it alone." The UN actually was a trap from the very beginning. But at least Senator Robert Taft recognized before it was too late. U.S. Senator Patrick McCarran, one of those who signed the UN Declaration, UN Charter, said later, "Until my dying day, I will regret signing the United Nations Charter." Americans, like Senator Patrick McCarran, if we do not reverse course now, will, until their dying day, regret the United States' participation in and continued involvement in the United Nations. The John Birch Society has for 30 years, over 30 years, said, get the United States out of the United Nations and get the United Nations out of the United States. More than ever, Americans must realize the necessity of doing so. We have many programs that we are working on to bring that about. One of our current programs, in which I am crisscrossing the country now on media programs across the country, is promoting our new book, Global Tyranny Step by Step. I think we have assembled here the evidence which will convince any reasonable person that the United Nations is far from the wondrous organization we've been led to believe. I'm confident that is doing so because I've been on many talk shows in just the last few weeks and found many people who were formerly considered themselves to be ardent liberals and supporters of the United Nations who have changed their minds after examining the evidence. One recent program on a large East Coast station here, a lady who said she didn't think she would ever agree with the John Birch Society on this. After reading the book, she said, "I am a liberal, New York, feminist, Jewish, New Age environmentalist who didn't think I would ever agree with you, but after reading this book, I disagree with you on a couple of things, particularly with regard to the environment. She was still an ardent environmentalist, but she says the evidence is overwhelming that indeed the movement toward world government and the dangers are clear, and they are bearing down on us. And so she opened up her airwaves and gave very enthusiastic and hearty reception to the book and to our message, and she's had us on a couple of times. The same recently, a couple of days ago, up in Connecticut and in Massachusetts, where we saw talk show hosts who considered themselves to be liberal McGovern supporters from the back in the 60s and 70s, who a couple of years ago were ridiculing any idea concerning the Trilateral Commission, Council on Foreign Relations. After reading the book and looking at the evidence, these guys said, well, honestly, I have to say that I'm convinced that you're not wacky. You've put together some very solid, convincing information, and we had the phones ringing off the hooks. America is waking up. So my purpose of my tour is to, first of all, inform the American people that we are being led into a trap, and then to let those people who are interested in finding out, if you want to get more information on global tyranny, on the Council on Foreign Relations, our 800 number is 1-800-CFR-PLOT. Very easy to remember. You can get more information from us and find out exactly what you can do to oppose it. One of the things we have been doing for many years and having increasing effectiveness in is putting pressure on or educating the American people as to how their congressman is voting. When it comes to the United Nations, it is only running and continues functioning because of the infusions of tax dollars from United States citizens. If we cut off our support to it, its threat would evaporate overnight. It could not function without the billions of dollars in all of its agencies, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the World Agricultural Association. And if you think that that is going to harm poor people around the world, then you need to read the chapter on the compassion con in global tyranny. So I point out the private organizations that are working around the world do far more than any of the government organizations, including the United Nations. In fact, the United Nations organizations have, in most cases, been aiding those totalitarian regimes like Mengistu's in Ethiopia and those places that have been the worst violators of human rights. But this little program right here is one which we have great hopes will cut off the funding for not only the United Nations, but many other programs which are destroying our constitutional system of government. This is a TRIM bulletin. TRIM stands for Tax Reform Immediately. And what we are doing here is a service, public service to voters and taxpayers across the country. They're not getting this information through their newspapers or through the usual sources of media. We give the actual voting records of the members of Congress, whether they voted for less taxes and less government or more taxes and more government. We tell them how much it's costing them, where they can check it even in the congressional record if they want to. Unfortunately, you can look in your daily newspaper, you can find all the statistics and details on the horse races, on the batting average and the pitching scores and all the sports scores and everything, but you can't find out how your congressman is voting, how your tax dollars are being spent. We're telling you this in the TRIM bulletin. We know when we get enough of these out in each congressional district that those congressmen are not going to be able to come back to you and keep sending your tax dollars overseas on foreign aid, on the United Nations, on all of the things that they're taxing you with. So we have many programs that we're working to bring this about. Again, I would say that the Americans, it's time to take a look. It could be that we are wrong. It could be that we are foolish alarmists who really have, who are just running around needlessly worried about things that don't exist. That could be. However, if we are correct, and the evidence is quite compelling, I think overwhelming, then it is time, American citizens, to begin to get to work. It's up to you to decide. You need to get the evidence to judge it for yourself. Then join us in the movement to get us out of the United Nations, get the United Nations out of the United States, and preserve the American constitutional system. Thank you.
Mr. Jasper will answer questions. If anyone would like to ask a question, please direct them.
Mr. Clausen, Christian Observer Magazine, you declare again and again, and it's a valid historical point, that the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. Those of us who have studied history, of course, recognize that God's law is the supreme court of the land since we have founded as a Christian nation. What is your position personally and the Birch Society on that historical fact?
Well, we point out that the Declaration of Independence, which preceded the Constitution and really set the tone and the principles for the Constitution, declared that we have, as created creatures by God, we have God-given inalienable rights. God created man, he endowed us with rights. He allows us then to use our intelligence and want to create governments to protect those rights. So yes, God is sovereign. We are his creatures. He has given us rights. We create governments to protect those rights. We see none of that mentioned in the United Nations Charter, nor not only is it not specifically mentioned, it is really antithetical to the whole notion and the underpinnings of the United Nations Charter.
The reason I ask is your own autobiography contains no public affiliation on your part with any religious organization.
No, the John Birch Society is not a religious organization, and we are made up of people of all different faiths. We don't ask a person their faith when they join. Most of our members would consider them Christians of one denomination or non-denomination or another. Many are people of different faiths. We have members who are Muslims, who are Jews, who are all different faiths.
I mean, your own autobiography here makes no public profession of any religious faith.
For your information, I'm a Roman Catholic.
Thank you.
Yes.
Wondering, how do you view the goals of lifting the ban on homosexuals in the military and women in combat fit into the goals of globalism?
Well, that's a very important point, and there's several different levels of concern here. We've had several issues of our magazine dealing with the lifting of the ban and of women in the military in combat roles. The important point as it relates to this, to globalism and to potential for world government, is very important, and it's could be brought home to us very soon. Last year in Australia, a ban on sodomy in Tasmania, part of Australia, was struck down because Australia had signed the UN Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, a UN treaty, which guarantees freedom of sexual orientation. So that national law or state law was struck down. The treaty overrode that law. The United States signed that treaty last year. George Bush sent it to the Senate, and it was ratified by the Senate. Again, as I mentioned, by an unrecorded vote, and according to all the information we can get, there were only 3 or 4 senators present, yet it was publicized as having passed by a 2/3 majority of the Senate. So it is now treated, in fact, as a ratified treaty. So far, no homosexual organization has brought suit against the U.S. military claiming that it is in violation of the UN covenant, but we could anticipate something like that happening, and if it then goes to court, it's up in the air as to what the court would decide, but it's possible that they would rule that that treaty overrides American law, and we could be forced, without Americans having any say in it, to lift the ban on homosexuals in the military. Now, that's a separate issue from whether or not we should. But I think most Americans, whether they are for lifting the ban or are against it, would agree that that is something that we here as American citizens should decide. It should not be decided by some United Nations treaty, by the United Nations World Court, or any other international body. That is an American issue. We should be able to decide that here. Personally, and for the John Birch Society and the New American Magazine, we have been completely opposed to lifting the ban. And for a multitude of reasons which have been very well expounded in the press by many different members of the military, there is no constitutional right to practice homosexuality. There is no, it is ridiculous to try and put it on the basis of race, to put a sexual practice on the basis of race. General Colin Powell was correct in stating that, as have been many other black leaders and other minority leaders. It is an insult to those who are of different racial minorities to associate that with a sexual practice which most people find not only repugnant but socially and medically and morally harmful to the country. Does that answer your question?
Well, what is the goal? What is the globalist goal? What's the agenda behind getting those things lifted?
Well, obviously, if the American military is a very important institution to American security, to American stability, to our whole society. If the American military is in effect destroyed, I've been in touch with many people in the military, career people, who say they'll leave if that happens. They simply won't be a part of it. Men who've been career high level in all branches of the military who agree that that will ruin the military. That seems to be the consensus of over 80% of the military, according to various polls. Obviously, destroying American military morale, destroying America's ability to protect itself, works towards advancing a new world order, a globalist agenda in which the United States is no longer a superpower, can no longer stand alone. Have another question?
In your historical summary of the CFR history and of the UN history over in our own American Republic this century, 3 or 4 names I did not notice mentioned by you, doubtless they're in your book. For instance, Woodrow Wilson in 1913, Colonel Edward House in the same year.
I have quite a bit of mention of them in the book. As say, there's 350 pages here in the book. It's hard to squeeze much into a less than an hour. So.
But I mean, notorious ingredients in the history of CFR and in the history of the UN. Another notorious ingredient, of course, is the notorious State Department official in 1945, the guy who was sent to jail for perjury.
Alger Hiss.
Alger Hiss.
Yes, he figures quite prominently in here. Alger Hiss, one of the reasons why the United Nations was from its very inception a subversive organization. He played a key role in designing the United Nations. He was head of the United Nations Conference in San Francisco. He appointed, he and his brother Donald Hiss appointed some 200 of the top UN officials. He was a Soviet agent, also a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and many others were as well. As I point out in my book, and besides Alger Hiss, we had Harry Dexter White, Henry Julian Wadley, Virginia's Frank Coe, Noel Field, Lawrence Duggan, David Weintraub, Nathan Gregory Silvermaster, on and on. All these were people who, like Hiss, were Soviet agents who were working for Stalin. They were traitors to the United States. These were the architects, the founders of the United Nations.
With respect to the general, pardon me for asking so many questions, but one of the, you make a special point about treason and subversion, which are concepts in history, laudable, important concepts. The concept of conspiracy is itself a well-grounded theory and fact in American history and in world history. The question is also related to that is, what about impeachment? The concept of impeachment in American history. For instance, those of us who wandered around Capitol Hill in our press work have run into people who say that there's going to impeachment proceedings are going to be undertaken, or maybe within the next 9 months, possibly, that being the period of gestation, against usurper President Hillary Rodham. She's going to be impeached for usurping the presidency, and some other guy who also lives in the White House called Slick Willie is going to be impeached for advocating the presidency and both of them are going to be impeached, according to my informants, for violating the Constitution umpteen times the first several weeks of the presidency.
Well, any impeachment proceedings, impeachment is an important procedure which shouldn't be trivialized or made frivolous, and we've certainly had many reasons for impeachment over the years of many officials and many presidents, actually. But the reality is, until a sufficient number of American citizens are informed, properly informed, and can then put pressure upon their representatives, we will not see an impeachment. The climate in Washington is such, and has been probably since the beginning, that those types of actions are not going to be taken unless there is perceived to be a strong groundswell for it from the grassroots. And that's what this is all about, informing people about the actual treason and subversion that is going on in our government, the peril that our basic rights and our basic institutions are facing right now. And if enough people become aware of that, and I believe they will, I haven't seen anything like this. I've been doing this for 20 years, and I have not seen anything like this in terms of awakening and people becoming very concerned. It's becoming quite obvious now. You can project the lines of where we are and where we're headed, and it's quite frightening, and should be to most Americans. It's easy to see. Government is growing, centralization of power in government in Washington, and now transfer and centralization of power on a global scale in the United Nations. Unprecedented. There has not been anything like this before. People are beginning to recognize this, and it's become more and more recognizable. And so I see a very growing movement, and that's what we're trying to encourage. One more question here.
Oh,
yes.
sorry. Follow-up.
The gentleman behind you had a question.
I know that your expertise is in the area of foreign affairs, but how do you see the goals of globalists domestically? What are they trying to accomplish to fit into their idea of a new world order, especially in the area of domestic social agenda?
Well, good thing you asked that. I have one of my chapters in Global Tyranny is on the UN grab for your child. This document is a UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. You can be almost certain that this will come before the U.S. Senate in the very near future. How do we know that? Because co-president Hillary Rodham has taken that, has always championed that as one of her key issues. As head of the Children's Defense Fund, she was one of the primary supporters of this UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. She has made known her public support for the concept of children being able to sue their parents. Now we see just in the last few days, a tremendous amount of coverage in the media of this case of the boy who sued his parents. A movie is being made of it. There's been all kinds of television specials about that. Mary McGrory yesterday in her syndicated column, which is carried across the country, promoted that, said that this whole idea, this sentimental idea of parental rights being sacrosanct has to be re-examined, saying that not all parents are good parents, and of course the old adage, hard cases make bad law, and extrapolating from this one boy's case to undermining all parental rights is a very dangerous assault on American family, on American children, and on American parents. This is coming up very soon, and this is one of the reasons why we're urging people to contact their senators, contact their congressmen to oppose this and other UN treaties. If the UN Treaty on Global Warming goes through, we will find another huge tax, a direct tax on all of our fuels, indirect taxes on all the regulations, and that will go through our whole economy. On everything that we consume, everything that we use will be taxed to supposedly stop this global crisis of global warming, which again, in our special Earth issue, we spent a great deal of time going through with all of the world experts on this, showing that there is certainly no consensus that there is even a crisis. In fact, the vast majority of scientists believe that there is not any global warming crisis. The meteorologists that signed the Heidelberg Declaration and the another one of the petitions signed by the leading world meteorologists. And certainly no justification for giving United Nations or any other international agency, global regulatory authority, or for causing American or other businesses or economies to expend hundreds of billions of dollars needlessly on wasteful programs. But that's coming at us from the United Nations. That's a domestic thing that's going to affect us, our jobs, our businesses, our cars, our daily lives. Those are just a few. In my chapter on the New World Money System, we see the way in which the proposals for turning the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, into a global Federal Reserve System, regulating all of our banking and our economic transactions and whatnot. Enormous effect that it will have on our every domestic expenditure, every transaction that we make. Something that no American should be willing to countenance or to turn over to any global bureaucracy. Those are just a few of the things that are going to affect Americans. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, taxing. If we allow the direct taxing authority, as Boutros-Ghali calls for, it is something we will certainly regret in years to come. Any further questions? Yes.
Well, coming back to your point about, you seem to strike a pessimistic, defeatist note when you said we can't do this, nothing will happen, and so on, about a simple little thing like impeachment. I'm not advocating it or condemning it.
I don't mean to. In fact, I don't mean to. Part of the problem here in showing people, getting Americans to first recognize the problem is then, once we've laid it all out, not to overwhelm them, make it appear that it's already a fait accompli. And I do not have a fatalist attitude toward this. I believe that this can be turned around, and impeachment is certainly one of the sure, it is one of the avenues which eventually should be and will be used. And I don't think right now there is sufficient understanding at present to use the impeachment in this regard, but I certainly look forward to that.
Since we are a Christian nation, even the 1993 AD is what all citizens in America use, 1993. We are barely 6 years away from the advent of the third millennium, which is simple Christian arithmetic. We're barely 6 years away from the closing of the second millennium. That's simple arithmetic. That's not rapture or something. It's just arithmetic. God willing.
Correct.
In that context, all of these things are possible. God willing. You're either a pessimist or an optimist. Whether we are professing Christians or not, these are facts. These are facts.
Yes.
Christian facts and so on. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you. Any further questions? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Jasper. Thank you, media, for attending, and that's it.